Hi guys, it's Signi from the Living Medicine Institute. My name is Dr. Signi Goldman, for those of you who don't know me, and I'm one of the co-founders of a training program for psychedelic-assisted psychotherapists. My partner in the training business is actually on her way back from Sarajevo right now, where she's been at a MAPS training. So this is interesting timing for us to just get on and give a quick response video to the FDA Advisory Committee's decision that's come out, and it's quite a bit in the press today. It's big and I think emotional for a lot of people, and it's the language often used in the headlines, as I've noticed them, is that it's a setback for those who are proponents of legalized psychedelics. And there's a sense in which that's certainly true for the momentum of legalized use of MDMA in clinics right away. But I would like to give my thoughts and say there's a lot more nuance to this situation and this entire conversation. I think what this advisory committee's recommendations more are is putting the foot on the brake pedal slightly in a bit. In other words, slow things down until the data really matches the standards that the FDA has for approving a new trial. And that is actually the FDA's job. They're doing their job there. Some of the reasons why the data is tricky for the FDA to evaluate in a situation like this is because we've never seen a treatment like this. It's really different in quality than any of the other drugs that they've had to approve before. You think about it. We're actually altering people's experience of reality. We are giving them a substance where they cannot be blinded. You may see that a lot talked about in the media reports, meaning there's no way to give one group the real thing, the psychedelic, and another group a placebo, and not have them know which group is which, because you kind of can tell if you're having a psychedelic trip or an altered state experience. And that is true for other medications in psychiatry as well. It's not a unique situation, but it does make it trickier and harder. This element with blinding is not a new information or a new story. The researchers themselves were aware of it and actually collaborated with the FDA early on in the process to sort of work around that as best they could in the way the clinical trials were conducted. So the blinding issue in and of itself, I don't think is the biggest barrier right now. I think the bigger barriers are to what degree that and some other pieces around the way the psychedelic studies have to be designed may affect the outcomes in ways that are misleading, and this issue of safety. And those can be broken down into various categories. Those of us who do this for a living or who are actually clinicians and work with psychedelics, I suspect have a little bit of a different take than the public might have reading the advisory committee's decision. Because a lot of the things that were raised in the hearing and that the committee is voicing concern about are things that we've been talking about all along in kitchen table type conversations amongst each other. So I'd like to speak a little bit to that and for that frame of reference to be out there for those of you guys who might be interested in it. One of the trickier things that I think it's hard for the press to fully wrap their minds around because they're coming as outside observers without understanding the nuances of the dilemmas that this field has been facing, is that this is the first time that the FDA is being asked to approve a substance. If you think about it, that's their job, approving a substance for safety, that is linked to a psychotherapy intervention. In other words, they're being asked to approve something that is combining a psychedelic with a psychotherapy. And they're being asked to consider the fact that those two have to go together. They really don't have a framework or template for that. That's never been something that they've done, and that there's definitely some awkwardness and also just real questions that are coming up as regulators about how do we regulate something that we actually don't know how to regulate and we don't have a system for. You heard some of the comments from the committee saying things like, we don't know what this therapy is, we don't know how to approve a therapy when it's not clear what it is. And that is actually an accurate assessment of the situation. Psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy as an emerging field right now, in a way, we're pretty clear on the safety profile of the substances themselves. MDMA is actually pretty safe compared to lots of things I prescribe as a psychiatrist today. It's not addicting when used the way it's used in clinical trials or planned to be used in clinical practice. And at the doses and the level of monitoring and the way it's used, it's actually quite safe. There are many things that I prescribe, like I say, that are way more concerning, and the data for them have been way more concerning, and yet they are legalized. So I think the barrier is not the substance, but there is confusion about what is the therapy that we're approving, because psychotherapy research is its own thing, and psychotherapy outcome research is its own thing. And that has, and in this case with these MAPS or Lycos sponsored trials that are in the media now, there is a request that the government consider those things as a linked unit. And that creates a lot more complication with the approval process. One is that those of us in the field, the actual professionals doing the work, actually don't have data to support what is the most effective therapy intervention. Different providers out there are doing slightly different therapy interventions, and it's not been standardized. And it has also not been what we call manualized, meaning, put into a manual for a clinical trial where everybody does it the same in a way that the whole field sort of agrees on. Now, the MAPS researchers did a good job of standardizing what they were doing and of accounting for what they were doing. But I think some people in the FDA are unclear. Are we approving this substance, or are we approving that this psychotherapy is the one that should always be delivered? And is there data for that? So that already makes it more complicated. And I think there's some realistic concern about how are we supposed to navigate that at the regulatory level and not to rush to conclusions. And one of the people in the panel was quoted as saying, this therapy has a lot of promise, but let's not get ahead of ourselves by stamping approval on this version when it may be that there's a better version and needs to evolve. So that's one of the things that makes this complicated, and there isn't really a straightforward solution to that, because we happen to live in a time and place where our regulatory bodies don't have a channel for which to consider an intervention like this. So it really is a paradigm shift, and in that sense, regulators have to reinvent the wheel a little bit. And their ultimate job is safety and making sure that they're doing that thoroughly. And they are trying to do that given the evidence that's available to them. It's worth saying here that most of the people who voted against approval also said that they think that these therapies show a lot of promise and that they hope that the research goes forward and does move forward. They're not saying they're opposed to MDMA being used for trauma. Most of them are saying we're just not quite there yet. There are some holes or gaps in the data that we need to have more clarity on and need to have more certainty on. And again, though that is really frustrating for those of us who do this work on the ground, because we see the suffering, the mental health burden, and the burden of suffering that's in our office, in our clinic, all day, all the time. We see that, and it's really hard not to know that something that could help is being withheld or delayed. So though it's very disappointing for us in a way on that level, it is also their job to make sure that these regulatory safety pieces are in place for the protection of the public. So along those lines, I do want to speak to some of the testimony that was given before the hearing and some of the concerns that the advisory committee stated about safety pieces, because there are safety concerns. I don't think that there were safety concerns in the design of the MAPS trials per se. To the extent that harm was done to some participants, which it was, that I think was attributable to inappropriate actions on the part of individual therapists or a therapist. People who were harmed as participants in that really were subjected to inappropriate touch, boundary violations, crossing of sexual boundaries. These are things that the entire mental health field understands are unethical and deeply, deeply concerning. This sort of phenomenon, sadly, is quite common in therapy practice in general, all across the country and probably the world. There are therapists that take advantage of the therapeutic relationship to cross boundaries with their clients, and there are psychiatrists that do that. There are always bad actors, unethical actors, and people who just shouldn't be doing the work because they're confused about boundaries themselves. In the legal, medical, mental health setting, we have accountability built in around that because we have things like, professional ethics and licensing boards, and you can take action if someone, crosses a boundary like that against them. And I think it is beholden on all of us to continue to have those protections in place that we already have in the mental health space when we move into psychedelics and mental health. And I do agree that it may be even more critical because it is true that MDMA can make people more susceptible to boundary violations. It can break down a person's sense of holding boundaries because they feel safer and they feel more affection for the people around them. And that is to some degree induced by the substance. So it is true that we have to be extra careful with that. That said, the model for the MAP studies included 2 therapists in the room, which is a really good safety precaution against that kind of thing. Another safeguard that the MAPS trials had was that all of the sessions were filmed. And there have been advocates suggesting that there continue to be filmed sessions, there continue to be more than one therapist in the room. And those are pretty robust safety precautions if that became standard in the way that this care was delivered. So I just want to name that, that there were a lot of cautions built into that could be continued to built in and should be continued to built in some form. And so that's an evolving conversation. But I think the studies were designed pretty responsibly in that way. Though there was concern that some of the therapists were not adequately trained to be careful with those boundaries or just, unfortunately, were bad actors. We are not going to get away from the fact that there's bad actors in mental health because it's already a thing. It's already existing. And the best that we can do is put in regulations and safety precautions in the way that we have our care delivery systems set up. And we do that already, and we could do it better, and we should continue to do it better, whether we are referring to psychedelics or just regular mental health treatment. That is true. One of the interesting angles on this, for those of us who are very much in the work, is that boundary violations and psychological harm, basically safety violations between providers and clients, are rampant more on the underground. Right now, a lot of psychedelic practice takes place in the illegal underground or in travel tourism, people traveling to other countries where they can participate in ayahuasca or other kinds of psychedelic circles or gatherings. In those spaces where things are less regulated by the government, there is quite a lot of ethical violations on the part of providers. People take advantage of the power dynamic. There's sexual assault and harassment, rumors that are pretty rampant. I myself have seen or been aware of many situations in the underground where power dynamics and boundary violations became problematic. And it's only responsible for us to acknowledge that this is a possibility that can easily happen with people who are not thoroughly trained, but also there's not regulatory safeguards where those people have accountability. Interestingly, the answer to this, the thing that would probably make all this safer would be legalization, where this work moved into a space where it was regulated, there was accountability for the therapists, and there were training requirements. We run a training program, and a lot of what we talk about are ethics and safety pieces around touch, the making sure that providers have done their own work so they don't have confusion around things like boundaries, and so that they're really able to be very healthfully present with the person, and that they are licensed providers so that they are responsible to licensing boards and can be reported for violations. So in a lot of ways, a lot of the harm, the real psychological harm that has been done in psychedelic settings is partly due to the fact that it is an unregulated setting. So legalization, in my mind, would actually help with those pieces. It doesn't mean that there would not still be bad actors in the legal space, because there already is and always has been. I don't think that in itself is a reason not to legalize the treatment, for the reasons I've just stated. I also don't think the fact that psychedelic treatments can harm people or have harmful side effects should prevent us from legalizing it. I'm a psychiatrist, and there's not a single medication that I prescribe that hasn't harmed some people in clinical trials and had negative side effects for some people. It's just the nature of any treatment, is that it will help some and it will harm some. And it is really important, and I think the FDA understands that we understand the statistical, the numbers on that, and hopefully how to predict it and how to ameliorate it, how to work with it as best as possible. But it is never an expectation that 100% of people who get a treatment improve and that 0% of people are harmed. There is harm built into any treatment. And what we as a society has done is we have accepted a certain level of that in exchange for the fact that there are large numbers of people who actually can be healed. And I believe that that's what will happen going forward with psychedelic research. Is, where we're at now with the data is there's just not enough understanding of how to track those harms. And there's some questions about to what degree they were fully reported in that data. And so those are things that the advisory committee would like to see cleaned up in future research. I don't think they're saying we do not want this treatment to go forward. I think they're saying it is, beholden on us to understand this more clearly for the safety of the public. And again, that's their job. Lastly, I will say that some concerns were raised about the almost religious fervor and that takes place around the dialogue in the psychedelic world and around psychedelic treatment. And there is something to this. The phrase I think that the Vox reporter used this morning was psychedelic evangelism. And I think that those that are raising that concern are seeing a real phenomenon. And I think it's valid that be in the conversation. The fact that people have a sort of evangelical fervor or enthusiasm around this work doesn't necessarily mean that it's not effective and shouldn't be approved either. But I do want to honor the fact in which that can make the conversation a little complicated for the public and for regulators. I think that Rick Doblin and the original community that surrounded him do have a lot of what I would say, almost a spiritual advocacy stance that this is going to make the world better. And they're pretty open about saying things like that. And I don't think that going into a clinical trial, anybody should be positing that a substance that we are using in mental health treatment is somehow going to make the world better in any kind of global way. I think that kind of dialogue, that may be their opinion, and they can have that opinion. But I don't think that should be part of the process of clinical approval of a treatment that's going to be used in a mental health clinic like mine. Many people who do this work, who receive these medicines in my clinic, do not perceive it as spiritual, and many people also do. But that is very individualized, and I do think that that has clouded the narrative a little bit. Now, there are reasons for that, and the reason is that these treatments are very compelling. You have a massive amount of suffering happening right now, right? And then you have a treatment that is often working for people that nothing else has worked for, quite often, and very quickly. And that we've never seen before. And those results are sustaining, which we also haven't seen before. So the level of enthusiasm that generates is understandable, because there is a certain amount of, wow, like finally, something that works, and we've never seen something work this well before. Add to that the experience of taking these psychedelic medicines is compelling. It's compelling to experience it. It's compelling to witness it. As someone who actually does this for a living and does it in my office all the time, it's moving to witness people's experience. We often call it their journey through this kind of treatment. And we don't have a history of other treatments in mental health that have that quality to them. that sort of transformative experiential quality. And it is true that spontaneously, even without therapists like myself prompting, a large percentage of people will experience the psychedelic state as having spiritual properties. They will feel that it is spiritual in nature, for lack of a better word. You could say transpersonal, or something bigger than them. That's inherent in the experience for quite a lot of people, though not all, but quite a lot. So when you take those factors together, the fact that we've had nothing that works, this works kind of quickly and seems to maintain, and it is transformative, it feels transformative, and it is really compelling to witness on the part of the providers. It's understandable that there's almost this level of reverence and a high level of enthusiasm that's developed around it. So understanding that, it is also true that from the point of view of the FDA, that should not be in the conversation, and that enthusiasm may have clouded the fact that psychedelics can also cause harm, that there's risks inherent in it. And the enthusiasm or the motivation to have this legalized so that people who are suffering can use it has sometimes steamrolled over the real safety concerns. And that's a valid piece that we need to talk about further, just collectively as a field. The safety concerns, to circle back to that, interestingly, are usually not from the substance themselves. That's pretty safe. It's psychological harm. People who are reporting bad outcomes, it's often it's not necessarily things with heart rate or what we think of as physical or medical symptoms. It's they're getting psychologically worse. Their mental health symptoms worsen, or they are traumatized or re-traumatized. And there has always been a phenomenon of a subset of people doing psychedelic work having those kinds of outcomes. Now, because this is a new practice in the legal space, I'm speaking, when I say there always has been, I'm speaking to the underground, where there's just been happening for decades, right? And I do think that it's the job of the FDA and those of us in the profession to mitigate against that. And people like myself and my partner, Dr. Sandy Newis, who work and teach in this space, have put a lot of thought into how to mitigate against that. I run a psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy clinic, and we do not have those kinds of outcomes. Now, I know that's easy for me to say, and you don't have to take my word for it, but we don't. And the reason is there's a lot of effort put into the safety of what we call the container and the follow-up and what we call integration, and that's done really extensively. And there's also a lot of work putting into vetting people ahead of time that they are ready and appropriate for this kind of work. And so my lived experience is that there are ways of making this safe. I also think that even in the legal psychedelic treatment space, which right now is predominantly using ketamine, and that's happening all across the country and even other countries, I do think there are providers that are not doing it safely. So we already are in a climate where, because it's not super regulated, there is people doing it more safely and less safely. So when you have something like the FDA looking at the first psychedelic treatment, it's important that be part of the dialogue, and that can be mitigated against by how the therapy experience is held. And then what that does is circles us back to the sort of core of the real dilemma for the FDA with this process, is that how do they stamp an approval on the therapy? What is the therapy intervention that they're approving? How is that proven to be safe? I think some of the people looking at the data are saying, okay, the substance is safe, but is the substance what's working, or is it the therapy attached to it? We can't tease those out. And is the therapy attached to it always safe? And I don't think they're saying it's not safe. I think they're saying the data isn't clear. The data can't prove that. And so there's just more work to be done with the data. So in conclusion, psychedelics moving into mental health is not going away. That horse has left the barn, or whatever that expression is, right? We are moving. This frontier in mental health is going to happen. It has to happen because it is more effective. It's just more effective. That being said, those of us who are really in the space, we do know that there are some places where a sort of slow down, whoa, let's just slow down and look a little more closely at some pieces, there's been truth to that. And the FDA hitting a pause button and saying, can we get a little more data in this and this and this area? In the future, I think we will look back and see that as a positive and necessary safety step, because it's beholden on us not to run away with our enthusiasm, even though that comes from a good place, and get ahead of losing track of some places where we may not be seeing safety pieces, where there needs to be more conversation. So those are my thoughts as of this morning. So thank you for watching, and we'll continue to engage with you guys and dialoguing around all of this as we all go forward and find out together what's going to happen and what this work is going to end up looking like. We're all responsible for it. We're all responsible for it. And I'm glad that multiple voices are able to be heard and be in the conversation. And I'm looking forward to those conversations landing in places that are careful and thought out. And I believe that will happen. Thank you.